Okay, in this module, what I want to do is demonstrate the installation of the vCenter server appliance. So what I have is my ISO image mounted here. So we'll go ahead and open this. If we go in the VCSA folder, we'll need to install the client integration plugin before we get started with this. So let's just do that really fast. Let's double click on that. And we'll go ahead and install that here. Might have this installed already. Let's just see. No. So we'll just give this a couple seconds. Once this is installed, then we'll come back to our ISO root. Okay, this should take a couple seconds more. Once this is installed, we'll double click on our setup here and then go through with our installation. It's taking a bit. Okay. Let's just start this in the meantime. Yeah, I see here telling us we need to have the client integration plugin installed. Just give it a few seconds more. Okay, so now that the client integration plugin has finished, we could continue from here. So we'll just open this file here. So it's the vcsa-setup HTML file. So go ahead and open that. And this should detect the client integration plugin is now installed. Good, so it did. So we basically have two options with our appliance deployment here. Either we are installing or we are upgrading. So go ahead and do an install. We'll accept our license agreement. Okay, so this is the target server IP address. Okay, so we would go ahead and point this to our ESXi host. Okay, if you already had a vCenter server, you're deploying a second one, you could point this there too, but we don't need that in our case. So let's go ahead and point this to 171. Okay, and this is the credentials for our vCenter server. Okay, so just hit next here. I'll just confirm that. But as we're at this here, we'll just make sure that our the host is not in lockdown or maintenance mode. Our host that we're deploying to is not, so this should work fine. Just give it a few seconds. Okay, so let me give this a name. Let's call this vCSA for the vCenter server appliance. Root is the username. Let me add a password for this. Okay. Let's hit next. Okay. So this is what we were discussing in our previous module. So we have a couple options here. We have our embedded PSC, In this case, we are installing the vCenter server along with that. Our second option we have is for our external PSC. Here we could install the PSC alone and then deploy the actual vCenter server and services on a separate box. If you could go ahead and deploy the platform services controller, then go on another machine and point the vCenter server installer to that. But in our case here, if you were doing multiple vCenter server, as illustrated here, that's when you will look at a scenario like this. But in our case, we'll go ahead and do an install with the embedded PSC. So we leave the default there, go next. This is the SSO domain we were talking about. I'll go ahead and create a new SSO domain, or we could join an existing one. Okay, so let's create a new one. So by default, the username is administrator. Let me just add a password to this. Confirm that. So you have an example here, vSphere.local. As I mentioned previously, this was static. You could not have changed this. In vSphere 6, you could. You have the option now. So we'll just leave it at what it used to be. So let's just vSphere.local. Let's just call this first site. Okay, this is the warning I was talking about before. So VMware recommendation is you have your SSO domain name different from your actual Active Directory domain name. Okay, so we should be good here. Hit next. This is the appliance size we were discussing. This is the same selection for the Windows-based vCenter server and the appliance. So we have our 4 options here. So tiny, small, medium, and large. So we'll go ahead and select tiny. Okay, if you notice in the description at the bottom, in this case it will use 2 vCPU and 8 gigs of memory with 120 gigs of disk space. If we select another small, you see it would use in this case 4 vCPU and 16 gigs of memory. So let's go back, set this to tiny, and then just hit next here. Okay, so this is important here. What we want to do is use thin provisioning for this, so just enable that and we'll go next. If our ESXi host had multiple data store, let's just go back here, sorry. If we had multiple data store here, we could point it to a different data store. We just have one on local disk there, so that's the reason why we're selecting. Well, that's the only one. Just hit next. Okay, so recall I did mention that for the VCSA or the vCenter Server Appliance, we don't have the option of using a Microsoft SQL server. Okay, so we either have the embedded or using the Oracle database. So we leave the default as embedded and hit next. For our management network, this is over on our ESXi host. If we had multiple networks here, we'll see that from our different port groups. But for now, VM network should be fine. Let me just enter an IP where we would be managing this. Just do 176. There. subnet mask, our gateway, our DNS server. Okay, so we're not going to connect over to NTP. We'll let this synchronize with the host. And we could enable SSH access. Let me just double check. Okay, this looks good here. We'll go ahead and hit next. Okay, so we just have that message there. Okay, great. So once we have a little summary of what it's going to do here, so we'll just go ahead and hit finish, and then this would start the deployment. Okay, so this will take a few minutes. Once this is finished, we would connect over to the browser, pointed to the address of this that we just entered, the .176, and make sure we have access there. Okay, so I'll just pause the recording for now, and once this is finished, we'll connect over there. Okay, so our vCenter server appliance has just been deployed. So we are at the finished screen here. If you notice here, we have the address where we would connect to manage this appliance. So we'll go ahead and connect to this. I just want you guys to have a look at the interface of this, and then we'll deploy the Windows-based vCenter server, and then you'll see that there's basically no difference between the two. So let me go ahead and connect to this. So this is at 192. So this is our address, 192.168.172.6, and then we'll do vSphere client. Okay, that should be it. Okay, so recall our username was administrator, and we're logging on to this SSO domain of vSphere.local. So let's do that, and our password that we configured. Okay, so we'll go ahead and log into this. We'll just take a couple seconds here, and we'll get into this. Okay, so we're in. This is our console for our vCenter server. What I'll do, I have a separate module where I'll introduce the interface, and then we'll deal with some of the basic stuff like bringing in our hosts, well, creating our data center for us and bringing in our hosts in here to be managed. So we'll cover that in a different module, but for now we're in the interface here. What I want to show you guys too is you could connect to the actual appliance. So let me connect over to that. The interface for the actual appliance. This is at 176. So in this case, we'll go to port 5480. Okay, I logged in previously to this, but let's just do that back. Okay, so here, the username on the actual appliance would be root, and this is the password we would have configured to. Okay, so we have some basic options here at the summary page. We could create the support bundle, we could reboot this box, we could shut down, have a look at the overall health status for this, any health messages. Notice our SSO domain here, status of that is running. We have the version of our appliance here. If we did configure a host name, you'll see that there. Let me just go through these like really fast. You have your SSH and your shell options here. You could enable them. We could go ahead and enable these here. For networking, you have a couple basic things here: host name, your DNS servers, your gateway. What this don't allow you to do though is to actually manage your IP addresses from here. Let me just open on this. You notice this has been disabled for actually updating your IP. So it's basically just to view this. I would recommend if you find that you need to use a different IP address for this afterwards, after you would have deployed it, I would recommend that you just deploy it over back from scratch. Okay, so we have our time settings here. We can set our time zone. We can set our synchronization. Currently, if you notice, we are syncing to the host, the ESXi box that this appliance is running on. We could change that here. We could disable that or point it to an NTP server. Coming down in the list here, we could check for updates. We could configure some of the update settings, like the repository. We could check for updates automatically, and then lower in that we have our administration menu where we could manage our password and set our password expiry and validity and those stuff under here. Okay, so what I want to do next is just go through a really quick installation of the vCenter Server Appliance in VMware Workstation. So recall, we went ahead and we deployed the vCenter Server Appliance here on one of our ESXi hosts. But for testing purposes, you could run your vCenter Server Appliance directly on VMware Workstation. I don't think this is supported by VMware, but just for testing, you could go ahead and make a few modifications to your config file and have the appliance run on your VMware Workstation. So I want to just demonstrate that, and then we'll move on to installing the vCenter server on Windows. So for us to do this, we'll need to go back to the installation disk for the appliance. So let me just minimize this. So here I am at the ISO, the VCSA ISO. If I come into this folder, the VCSA, this is where we had the client integration plugin installed from too. So this file here, just below it, the VMware-VCSA, is actually a OVA file. So what we'll need to do is copy this from here. Let me just put this on the desktop. So once we have this on the desktop, we'll just we'll need to rename this. So we'll rename this and add the OVA extension at the end. Okay, so that's that. So let's come back to our VMware workstation now, and we'll just go ahead and open a virtual machine. So our VCSA that we just configured was running within this hypervisor here, the ESXi5. So what we'll do now is have our appliance run right at the side with these here rather than within another layer. So we'll go ahead and open a virtual machine. Just go to my desktop. Here this is. So we'll just double click on that. We'll leave the default name for now. Should be fine. And we just import this in here. Accept our license agreement. Okay, this will just take a couple seconds. Once this is imported, we have a couple configuration changes we'll need to make on our VMX file. That's our configuration file for the virtual machine. So I'll just bring that up in the meantime. Okay, so we need to add these configuration to our VMX file before we power on this machine. And along with this, I need to make another change in that VMX file too, so this could work in my testing environment here. So let me just pull that VMX file up. So I have this in my virtual machine directory here. This is our VMX file that we need to edit. So let's just bring this up here. So at the bottom of this, we'll just need to add some config. So basically, this is the address family. So we're using IPv4, it's static. This is the IP address, the mask, the gateway, the DNS server we're pointing to, and the password. So let's just copy all of this here. Go to the bottom here and just add this. And for my environment, I need to make one more change to this here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save this. And I think that should be it. Okay, good. So you now notice that this appliance is listed here, so we'll go ahead and just power this up. If you notice, it's SUSE Linux. This is running here, so it'll boot to this in a couple of seconds. There it goes. This would actually take a good 20 minutes or so. So I'll let this run. I'll pause the recording, and once this is finished, we'll connect back to this and log in. Okay, so this deployment is now finished, so we'll try to connect over to this appliance at the .200 address. Okay, so in this case, 192.168.19.4/vSphere. Okay, so let me just go ahead, proceed to this, and log in. if you guys recall, this password is what I would have set in the VMX file. So I'll just enter that. By default, this is at vSphere.local, and we enter that password. This should log us in. Okay, seems like this is working. Okay, so here we have our vCenter server appliance deployed in VMware Workstation. So this is just another way you guys could configure this for your lab setup if you're following along. You notice here, it's running in VMware Workstation, not on the actual host.